The World Between Us is a Taiwanese series that came out in 2019. I watched it over on HBO Max, but it's also available on Hulu, I think. There are 10 episodes. Each episode is about 50 minutes, give or take a few minutes. The series covers the aftermath of a violent mass shooting and follows a cast of characters that are all connected and affected by this incident, including the victims' families, the killer's family, and members of the media that cover the story. This is a very politically and socially charged series. It uses the tragedy of a mass shooting as a vehicle to address and discuss many important issues, including news media sensationalism, mental illness, and the effects that trauma, grief, and loss have on not just individuals, but also on a collective society. Something I was really impressed with was the show's ability to balance the delivering of its commentary on political and social issues with its story and character development. In other words, while its message is powerful and thought-provoking, the show is also just really entertaining as a story. It sucks you in right away, right from the very first episode, and keeps you invested with characters that are really well developed and fleshed out. In order to tell the story of so many different people that experience and convey such intense and complex emotions, the acting had to be up to par for the show to work. And that's exactly what the cast of The World Between Us delivers. Every actor does a great job at playing their role in creating a convincing cast of characters and a realistic world, with a few simply amazing performances that stand out above the rest. Seriously, guys, the acting really blew me away. The show does not have one true protagonist and instead focuses on a group of many different characters. Each individual character's own story and experiences are weaved together with the others, strengthening all of the characters individually and as a collective. This intentional dynamic reflects part of the show's commentary, that in society, both the individual experience and the collective experience are tied together and both affect each other. There are no clear good guys and bad guys, just different people connected and affected by the same tragic event, all processing, responding, and dealing with it in their own ways. For the most part, this is a serious drama, which of course fits with its serious subject matters. It is a story of trauma and grief. However, for every heartbreaking moment, there is also a wholesome, feel-good moment that will make you smile. For every time something happens that makes you angry and outraged, there is also a moment of comedic relief. Watching this show truly feels like an epic journey. You'll definitely have to get through some tough times along the way, but I promise you, I guarantee you, by the end, you will feel satisfied and rewarded for the time you put into it. The cinematography is straightforward and crisp, and the handheld style of camera work perfectly fits in with the idea of news coverage and TV news. It's like the show itself is a news piece, covering the story of these characters in the fair, balanced, and complete way that the news stations within the show do not. And at the same time, it is the coverage of the social commentary the writing aims to convey. Perhaps this is a message within the show's narrative style, the suggestion that sometimes fictional works can actually paint a clearer and better picture of important social issues than the actual news can. While conducting my insanely in-depth research on the Wikipedia page for this show, I came across a really interesting blurb that talks about how the screenwriter crafted the story for this show. And I think this really fits in with what we were saying, which is that fiction can be this amalgamation of different truths, real people's thoughts and stories, and this can become a whole that, although isn't in and of itself a real true event, can still contain so much truth within it. English majors will know what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's right, people who say, I only read nonfiction because fiction is a waste of time. Anyways, aside from the possible metaphor within the cinematography, the camera work also just creates this sense of immersion. You will feel like you are right there in the scene with the characters, as a moving piece within the puzzle of the story. This in turn also makes everything said in the show more realistic and feels more genuine. So if you haven't seen this show before and this review has got you interested, here's a couple things you should know before you watch. And hopefully I can help you decide whether this is the show for you. So one of the only complaints I had about this show was the subtitles. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't have a problem with the idea of reading subtitles in general, and if that's an issue for you, then you're on the wrong YouTube channel. But these subtitles in particular were kind of hard to read. They are in white and thin font and often appear over white or light parts of the shots. Also, in my humble opinion, they come and go just a little too quickly. This wasn't a huge, I can't even continue watching this show kind of problem for me. Obviously, I still ended up finishing it, and yeah, I eventually got used to it, but there were still times where I had to go back and reread certain lines. So again, not a deal breaker, but something that you're gonna have to get used to. As I said before, this show deals with a lot of social and political issues, and isn't shy about addressing them and using its characters to voice very blunt opinions on them. Of course, it's just a show, guys, and this is all meant to commentate on real-life people and beliefs like this. But yeah, for those of you who feel these issues are close to home, or you just have strong opinions of them and anything to the contrary would get you all hot and bothered, this show is definitely provocative in that sense. So I guess just fair warning, be ready for that. Alright guys, that's gonna do it for this spoiler-free section of the review. I hope you found it informative, and if you haven't seen the show before, I hope I was able to get you interested in watching it. If you are looking for something to watch that is truly powerful, emotionally charged, something that will just fuck up your entire world while you're watching it and will have you thinking about it after you finish it, then this is the show for you. I'm not saying that I cried when I watched this show, but I'm not going to say that I didn't cry either, so I'll just leave that there. This is 210 East, thanks for visiting the channel, and with that being said, I'll now be moving into a little bit of analysis and my deeper thoughts on the show with spoilers, so for those of you that don't want spoilers, this is where you stop watching. And for everyone else, let's get into it. So I think one of the ways The World Between Us frames and contextualizes its story in various commentaries is by showing how the small world and the big world differ, interconnect, and affect each other. First, let's just establish what I mean when I say big world and small world, because I'm kind of just paraphrasing these terms from a book, which I'll get to in a minute. But for now, let's just say our small world is our immediate, individual, personal world, our close relationships, jobs, dreams, problems, etc. Our internal self. Then let's say our big world is the collective society we are a part of, which can also be thought of as a kind of entity in and of itself, our state, our country, our culture, religion, etc. In life, we all exist within these two worlds at the same time, and I think this show really does a good job at showing these two concepts and how they exist in everyone's experience of life through its narrative style. We are brought into each character's personal life, learn their deepest secrets, fears, and troubles, and their hopes for the future. We see how each of these individuals are affected by a traumatic event, and at the same time, the show also covers the collective experience of a society, and how society as a whole also processes and is affected by this traumatic, tragic event. And as I mentioned before, the show does a great job at showing how each can affect the other. One man becomes a killer, and in doing so affects an entire society. An entire society condemns and ostracizes a family and their collective outrage and grieving, and thus affects that entire family's future and their personal lives. This dynamic is mirrored by the show's narrative style, where we get such detailed character development, but are also kept in tune with the collective big world through the lens of the news station and the news coverage, and also the media in general, including social media, of course. Just as all the characters are connected by the same tragic event, they are all also literally connected as the show progresses. Apologies for all of the names I'm about to butcher, I mean no disrespect. Li Ta-shi and her family, with Su Yue and her family, and finally Xiao En and her family. All of these characters end up connecting and meeting each other and getting to know each other. their small world connected because of things happening in the big world. Let's not forget Wang Shi, the lawyer, and his family, who essentially becomes the common thread for all of these characters, whether he represents members of their family or gets to know Xiao En's brother-in-law, the doctor, and also appears on the station that Xiao En is a part of. I think there is a definite message here in this role that Wang Shi plays. Think about the last shot of the show, the very last one, with Wang Shi and the doctor smiling at each other and then walking away together side by side. Why show them as the last shot like this? I don't know about you guys, but when I saw this, it made me think about their roles within society as a doctor and a lawyer, and how each of these families features people who work as a kind of public servant. Doctor, lawyer, journalist, each of these are professions that help the public to serve society and try to make it a better place. Wang Shi is a great example of how these two worlds connect and affect each other as well. His own personal beliefs and ideals affect his actions and his decision to fight for the greater good of society. However, this path he has chosen also comes around full circle and affects his small world of his family. And there is a moment where it seems like he might have to choose between the bigger world and the smaller world of his family. I think the message here is that just like one person can affect many with their actions in a negative way, like a mass murderer, a tragic shooting, one person can also affect many in a positive way, like a doctor helping someone with their mental health, like a lawyer making sure a person or family who may not be able to afford representation gets a fair trial and experience of the judicial system as it was meant to be, or a journalist who chooses to provide fair and balanced coverage of what happens in society, with the aim of reaching further understanding instead of reaching higher ratings. Each of these professions would do all of this 100% of the time in a perfect world, but as we know from real life experience as well as in the show, this isn't always the case. As is shown most prominently through Xiao En's character, we cannot create change from the outside by quitting or walking away from these issues. We must do it from the inside, and from there do what we can as individuals for the greater good of society. So this concept of the big world and the small world, like I said before, is borrowed from the book The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. I've mentioned this book in my review for the Indian series Lakon Maik, and I'm mentioning it again here, and I might just mention it again in the future, multiple times. It's an absolutely amazing book. It slaps, it hits different, it's lit. No, but seriously, I would recommend this book to anyone who is a fan of literature and poetic prose and amazing stories that touch you deeply. One of the concepts in this book is the idea of small things and big things. And for those of you who have read this book, you'll see why I'm making the comparison here. But yeah, let me just stop rambling. It's a great book. Check it out. So trauma is obviously another big theme in this series, and it fits in nicely with the framework of big and small that we just covered. There is individual trauma as seen in our main group of characters, and collective trauma of the angry mob, the people on social media, society at large, which is fed news coverage it must then digest and process collectively. Similarly, this model is seen within a question the show raises. How are killers like Xiao Ming made? Is it by nature or nurture? Nature being the individual, nurture being the outside influence. Another big topic this show covers is loss and grief, and how people deal with and live with them. In particular, I really like the way the show portrays different kinds of grief and loss. We have characters like Xiao En who have literally lost loved ones. Her son is dead and gone forever. But we also have characters like Li Taxi, who lost her brother to his mental illness and the crime he committed, as well as her family who she must act like are dead. It can be said that when one loses someone dear to them, a part of them dies too, and this is so beautifully conveyed in the show as well. Xiao En loses a part of her when her son dies. She loses the person she used to be. whereas Li Ta-shi literally loses her identity, her actual name, as she has to change it and live an entirely different life. These two characters who, besides being literally connected and interact within the story, are also connected and interact thematically. Another way that trauma and loss and grief reaches the big and the small is its rippling effect. And this is another reality that I think was shown really well in the storytelling. When one person kills many, it's not just the victims who suffer, because each of them have families that are forever affected by their loss. And in turn, people around those in these families are affected as well. And then you have not just the victims, but the family of the killer themselves, who also suffer immensely. The irony set up of Li Ta-shi's family being symbolically sentenced to death should not be lost on anyone watching this show. Of course, the victims literally died in the shooting, but these people who are ostracized and condemned by society also die in a way because they cannot get back their former lives. All of these people, all of these characters suffer loss in their own ways, and the show portrays each of them side by side and creates comparisons and ironies. One of these comparisons brings us to another theme in the show, which is mental illness and mental health. There are a lot of parallels drawn between trauma, loss, and grief, and mental illness. I think the two characters that represent these two themes are Li Ta-shi and Su Sung. Li Ta-shi has the trauma and grief of a tragic event, her brother's crime, and Su Sung has his diagnosed schizophrenia. Even though these are two different things, there are a lot of similarities in their predicaments and mindsets. Both have to deal with something that caused them to feel stuck or trapped, unable to live their lives freely and do the things they want to do. Both must find a way to move forward with something that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. They must learn to adjust and learn to reintegrate themselves into the world around them, the big world. I think the relationship that develops between these two characters is a signaling by the show to make us aware of this comparison, showing how these characters can relate to each other. Another way the show compares mental illness with the idea of trauma and grief is the stigma associated with both, and how those connected to each are treated by others. There is also an element of alienation that comes as a result, whether from these outside forces or internally. Li Ta-shi and her family are ostracized, judged, and condemned for being related to a murderer. No one wants to be associated with them. They also internally feel like they do not deserve to live happy lives due to their guilt and shame. On the other hand, Su Yue and her brother face another kind of discrimination and judgment because of his mental illness. Su Yue experiences this with her fiancé and potential in-laws, who do not want to be associated or related to someone with schizophrenia. They fear it might be passed down to their future kids. Throughout the show, the topic of mental illness is addressed and discussed by many characters in many instances, within the context of crimes like the one the show centers around. It's a very social, political, and of course controversial discussion. I'm not really going to go too far into it since obviously it's very complex, but one thing I did want to mention was what I thought was a clear message the show sends, and one that I think is super important. Basically, it's the show's highlighting of the importance of having someone there for you when you're going through a tough time or dealing with something like mental illness or grief. Even if it's just one person who is truly on your side and there to listen and to understand you. The implication is that in the absence of such a positive and supportive presence, one can feel alienated and misunderstood, and perhaps this is what leads to tragedies like what occurred in the movie theater that day. The show doesn't imply that just by having someone by your side through tough times means there's no chance of something like that happening, that this is a foolproof solution, but I think it's probably a pretty big help, and in some cases the best we can do. Su Yue is probably the character that most embodies this sentiment, but also Wang Shu and Xiao En's sister, Xiaoping. They are people that truly care about helping others by way of empathy and a genuine desire to understand them. Su Yue is probably the best example of someone who stands by her friends and family no matter what. And I thought it was this part of her character that was so crucial for Su Sung's eventual positive ending for his character. Perhaps the best moment or scene in the show that embodies this idea is the scene where Su Sung turns up at the hospital and surprises and confronts Xiaoping. Her choice to talk him down and really try to understand him and listen to him and what he has to say potentially saved her life and his, and it was just such a powerful scene. Later, we find out that Xiaoping is a black belt, meaning that she could have easily taken Su Sung down with physical force, but that wouldn't have really helped anything. Instead of the police being called and Su Sung being arrested, which would have been really bad for him seeing as he already had that incident at the school on his record, she deals with it herself and not only de-escalates the situation but actually helps the guy out. And I think this scene functions as a microcosm conveying an alternative way to address mental illness, not by meeting it with harsh force and rejection, but understanding and empathy. Look, don't get me wrong, I understand on a literal level sometimes this kind of method just isn't possible and the situation might be too dangerous, but I think the message here in general is still valid. So the last thing I wanted to go over is this theme in the show of the media and news stations' role in society and how they contribute to the way we are taught to think about some of these other issues. Let's go back to Li Xiaoming and think about his motive for killing. Throughout the show, one of the biggest questions raised is why? Why did he do it? Eventually, we find out through his last letter that Li Xiaoming did it because he wanted to do something earth-shattering. Sadly, it seems like he ended up getting exactly what he wanted, and the news coverage and sensationalism around what he did made him famous and well-known, even if it was for the wrongest of reasons. There's a line in the show where Xiaoen and her news station are accused of killing with words instead of bullets. And I thought this was a really powerful statement. When the news covers and identifies people involved in crimes, and I don't just mean the person that did it, but their families as well, it invites the public collectively to judge them and attack them. I won't get too much into my own beliefs here, but I will say I think there is a kind of comfort and self-assurance, a satisfaction even, in judging others, because it distances yourself from them and whatever wrong or evil they have done, making you feel better about yourself. And I think this is definitely true today with social media. In this review I found online, I learned the Chinese title for this show directly translates to "The Distance Between Ourselves and Evil." The review goes on to say how the show creates characters that all deal with their proximity to evil, whether by association or enabling it in some way, even if it was unintentional. And I think this collective mob mentality of feeling better by judging others is a way of creating that distance between oneself and evil. The reality, of course, is that evil is not always so black and white, and good and evil are terms that are largely subjective. But having the opportunity to see it as black and white is much easier for people to digest. We can think back again to how the show suggests the best way to address mental health and these kind of situations, which is true understanding and empathy, instead of just labeling people evil and monsters, which of course does nothing to help the problem but is super convenient. In the show, we see so many examples of how media and news sensationalism affects people. All of this being said, I want to try to end on a positive note, and I'll use a quote from Li Tashi herself when she says in episode 9, "Who cares what the world thinks? What matters is what we think about ourselves." And I think this brings everything full circle with what we talked about in the beginning with big worlds and small worlds. When we think about her brother, we see someone who desperately tried to make a big impact on the big world because of his struggle and hardship within his own small world. Li Tashi's quote is a direct opposite approach to this, a solution. Don't focus on what everyone else thinks about you, the big world. What matters is what you think about yourself. And if you're good with yourself in your own small world, the big world is just separate from you. And though you may be part of it, it doesn't mean that it has to define you either. Alright guys, that's going to do it for this review. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for stopping by the channel once again. What are your thoughts on this show if you've seen it? Did you love it as much as I did? Was it as powerful for you as it was for me? What were some of your favorite moments? Give me your own review, give me your analysis, or just say what's up. Want to shout out to Nana Bliss once again for recommending this. Thanks so much. This is 210 East. Thanks for watching. Hopefully I'll see you again in another video.